Well, good morning. Today, Police Commissioner Ray Kelly and I are joined by law enforcement professionals who have been instrumental in the historic 34% decrease in crime that New York City has enjoyed since 2001. A decrease we've achieved even while our police officers have maintained a dramatically lower rate of discharging their firearms than police in most other major cities have, and a drop in crime that we've also accomplished while also reducing reliance on incarceration by 31% since 2001, a decline that has bucked a contrary national trend. With us today are Queens District Attorney Richard Brown, Richmond County District Attorney Dan Donovan, and former New York County District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. Also joining us are leaders of organizations representing more than 35,000 NYPD police officers, detectives, and supervisors. These veteran law enforcement professionals are all deeply committed to protecting the safety of our city. And today, they join the police commissioner and me in urging New York City Council not to threaten all that we've achieved in making New York the safest big city in the nation. Specifically, that means the City Council must reject two proposed local laws that are expected to come before it this week. Intro 1080, which would permit lawsuits against the NYPD based on the, quote, disparate impact, unquote, of police practices, and Intro 1079, which would establish an independent inspector general with broad authority to investigate and weigh in on police policies and practices. Let's take a look at the real-world impact these bills would have using a recent example of the NYPD's response to crime. Earlier this month, the NYPD announced a variety of widely reported crime prevention tactics in the wake of a series of shootings during the weekend of June 1st. There was no controversy about these measures and no protests, and that's because they were what anyone would want and expect in addressing a spike in crime. For example, Commissioner Kelly ordered assignment of additional uniform officers to public housing developments citywide. That was because many of the shootings had occurred in public housing complexes, a common sense thing to do. Most people would agree. Nevertheless, under Introductory 1080, the NYPD could be sued for implementing this tactic due to a potential, quote, disparate impact, unquote, based on housing status. The commissioner also ordered, quote, personnel to focus on the 9 commands that experienced multiple shootings, unquote. Again, smart, basic policing. Concentrate resources in the neighborhoods that saw the spikes in shootings. But because these were predominantly minority communities, Intro 1080 would permit lawsuits challenging this strategy as causing a potential disparate racial impact. The commissioner also directed investigators to, quote, monitor gang-affiliated street crews for any evidence of planned retaliation based on the shootings over the weekend, unquote. Again, smart policing. But Intro 1080 would permit lawsuits challenging this strategy because of a potentially disparate impact based on sex and age, since nearly all gang members are male and under 30 years old. The lawsuit would allow the lawsuits the bill would allow against the tactics of Commissioner Kelly wouldn't just cause a possible financial burden and tie up officers in court and take them off the streets. The state courts could also ban the police tactics the commissioner ordered. Think about that. The NYPD would be unable to take some of the most basic crime prevention measures anyone would expect our police to take. Okay. What about the effect of Intro 1079, the Inspector General bill? Take the monitoring of street crews that I just mentioned. Intro 1079 would allow gang members to make anonymous complaints about this to the new Inspector General. They wouldn't have to allege unnecessary use of force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, or offensive language to make a complaint. Nevertheless, the Inspector General would have to review, and the NYPD would have to dedicate time and resources to answering the gang members' anonymous complaints. In the future, any police commissioner would have to dedicate precious resources to disproving anonymous complaints about such basic fundamental police operations. And before deploying resources to neighborhoods in need, as Commissioner Kelly did earlier this month, and as he has done for the past 11 years, in the future, any police commissioner also would have to first consider the possible opinion of an inspector general. We also ought to look at the results of the tactics the NYPD employed in response to that uptick in shootings earlier this month. During the week ending June 2nd, there were 20 shootings in the 9 precincts in question. During the week ending June 9th, however, there were a total of just 4 shootings in those same 9 precincts. Let me urge the council members who represent those districts to consider the results before voting on bills that will make quick action by a police commissioner and proactive policing by police officers extinct in our city. New Yorkers must have policing that respects everyone's rights, including everyone's right to be safe on the streets. And what we mustn't have is what these laws would create: a police department pointlessly hampered by outside intrusion and recklessly threatened by second-guessing from the courts. On that note, let me turn the floor over to the Police Commissioner, Raymond Kelly. Ray?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When you examine the track record of crime fighting of the Bloomberg administration, the numbers speak for themselves. They show us that our practices and strategies are working. You look at the double-digit reductions of crime over the last decade, the reductions of murder to its lowest levels in modern history, the fewest shootings victims since we began collecting this data 2 decades ago. The 11 years since 9/11 attacks that followed immediately after by an anthrax attack, we have not seen one New Yorker wounded or killed as a result of a terrorist attack, unlike every other decade in the past half century. Yes, we've been lucky, but we work hard to make our own luck. Now, despite repeated attempts since 9/11, terrorists have failed time and time again in plots against New York City. But take heart, Al-Qaeda wannabes, because the City Council has found a way to undermine our partners that the NYPD has carefully constructed over the past decade, partnerships with both domestic and foreign entities. Those partnerships have helped keep New York safe. Now, if you think our partners will stand idly by to a review of their own sensitive operations by an ill-conceived notion of an inspector general, think again. They will simply walk away. Thousands of New Yorkers are alive today who wouldn't be otherwise as a result of the proactive strategies of this department. So how will this impact on police officers? How will it affect our resources? Well, there are many ways, but one of the ways will be by tying police officers up in endless depositions when they should be on patrol, or consuming their time with responses to investigative requests from an inspector general. This would be a devastating diversion of police resources when we need them out on the street. Not to mention the chilling effect of the disparate impact legislation, as the mayor said. That's not to say that everyone loses, because the legislation would generate so many frivolous lawsuits that its sponsors may well have called it the Full Employment for Plaintiffs' Attorneys Act. So if you are young, you have standing to sue. If you are male, you have standing to sue. If you're in a street crew, step right up and file your notice of claim. If you live in a prime time, a high crime neighborhood, ditto. And who will pay the biggest price for this? The law-abiding residents of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Now, until this threat emerged to upend all of this progress, they have been the greatest beneficiaries of the department's crime-fighting strategies over the last decade. Compare Mayor Bloomberg's 11 years in office with the preceding 11 years, and there have been 7,364 fewer murders. That's 7,364 lives saved. And if history is any guide, those lives saved are largely the lives of young men of color. These gains have been paid for in blood, and the sacrifice of 18 police officers who gave their lives in the line of duty since 2002, together with countless other officers throughout our history. In their names, and the names of their loved ones, and in the names of every innocent victim of violent crime, we stand together today to oppose this misguided legislation. Mr. Mayor.
I didn't touch it. Let me also point out we are 1 week before the midway point in calendar 2013. Comparing the murder rate in calendar 2013, the first 6 months, to the last 4 years, we're roughly 30% lower than every single one of those years. This is after a record low murder rate never before seen since we started keeping statistics in 1963 occurred last year, and we're roughly 30% below that this year. If that doesn't give comfort to parents, I don't know what will. Parents can lose a child, and there's no bringing that child back, but the likelihood of that happen has gone down dramatically thanks to the work of the world's greatest police department. And to jeopardize the lives of the kids going forward is just, I would argue, unconscionable. Let's now hear from the distinguished prosecutors who are here today for their comments, starting with Richmond County District Attorney Dan Donovan. Dan?
Thank you very much, Mayor. The achievements that the Mayor just described, the Police Commission just described, didn't happen by accident. And they're doing this. The Police Commission has about 6,000 less police officers than were working at the time, the day before the tragedy, September 10th. So the remarkable achievements they've had made over the years has been done with less police officers, and at that time they weren't dealing with something called terrorism. I think people have good intentions. There's no one individual up here that wants anyone's civil rights violated. But there are mechanisms in our court system already that address those violations when they occur. I think the good intentions that people had in proposing legislation, they never realized the unintended consequences. The unintended consequences of this legislation is jeopardizing public safety. I read somewhere where someone was saying all these stop and frisks have produced so few guns. Well, I think that's one of the reasons for that is people are afraid to carry a gun now. The Police Commission and I announced right in this room a while back a program on Staten Island called Cash for the Stash, because we found now a lot of people are using what we call community guns, guns that are hidden in a broken mailbox, guns that are hidden under a rock or an abandoned car, because no one wants to carry a gun any longer. Years ago, people used to carry a gun. Then when they got too dangerous for them to carry a gun, they used to give it to a juvenile. And when we changed the laws addressing juvenile crime, now no one wants to carry a gun. That's because of the work, the stop, question, and frisk work that the men and women in the New York City Police Department have done. I think last year, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner, we had about 418 murders. And the same calendar year, we had 475 suicides. More people last year killed themselves in New York City than were killed at the hands of one of their fellow citizens. That's just a remarkable number when you think about it. Not to downgrade the tragedy of suicide, but just to put it in perspective of how few homicides we've had in a city of 8.4 million people. This is not certainly a political issue. We have a district attorney who's a Democrat. I'm a Republican. We have my former boss, Robert Morgenthau here, retired district attorney who's a Democrat. Both of these men have much more seniority than me. I have much more height than they do. But it just shows you that this just goes across the whole spectrum. All of us here are concerned with the safety of the public. That's why we all took the jobs that we have. And the fear that we all have is if this legislation passes, the unintended consequences is those successes in New York Police Department are going to be history, and we're going to go back to the way we were in the past. So I encourage all of those elected officials who have a vote this Wednesday on this legislation to reconsider, look at the unintended consequences, and please vote this legislation down. Thank you, Mayor.
Dan, thank you. During a tenure of more than 20 years, Queens District Attorney Richard Brown has made his office, I think it's fair to say, one of the most widely respected prosecutors' offices in the nation. Dick, would you say a few words?
That's good. First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your kind remarks. I just want to add my voice this morning to those of the Mayor and the Police Commissioner in expressing my opposition to these legislative proposals. With all due respect to their sponsors, it's my opinion that these proposals are ill-conceived, unnecessary, and unworkable. And most importantly, if they become law, they're going to undermine the police department's ability to continue to effectively carry out its critically important responsibilities. I believe that we should be extremely cautious before we take away from our police officers the tools, the flexibility, and the independence that has enabled them to make our streets so much safer. We already have in place a host of agencies that provide effective oversight and monitoring the work performed by our police officers. We don't need another level of oversight. We already clearly, under the law, prohibit racial profiling and require that our police officers have a legal basis for stopping and questioning our citizens. Our current legal system provides ample opportunity for concerns about police policy and operations to be both the subject of public debate and for judicial review in both civil and criminal proceedings. Enacting legislation that will create additional layers of oversight and new grounds for injunctive relief in the courts will neither increase public safety nor enhance public policy. To the contrary, it will only lead to redundancy, inefficiency, confusion, and, as has been pointed out, extremely costly litigation. No one's suggesting, as Dan suggested to you a few minutes ago, that we trade our constitutional rights for public safety. But by the same token, we should not sacrifice public safety by enacting unnecessary and unworkable legislation that will make it more difficult for police officers to do our job. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Dick, thank you. There we go. I'll hold it for him. Few prosecutors in our nation have had a more illustrious career than our next speaker. Former New York County District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, a real legend and somebody who has seen it all, and he's been through ups and downs in this city. He certainly has the perspective and the intellect to understand what it takes to keep our citizens, you and I, you and me, and our kids safe. Bob?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Having been around the block a couple of times, I think it may be worthwhile to talk about the long, tough, uphill fight to reduce crime in New York City, capped by 11 years of significant reduction under Mayor Bloomberg and the Police Commissioner Kelly. Shootings in the last 11 years are down by 45%. When people thought can't go any further. But when I became district attorney in 1975, there were 648 murders in Manhattan, 1,998 in the city as a whole. When I left office, there were 58 murders in Manhattan, and last year there were 414 murders in the city. But that didn't come quickly or easily. It was a result of a major effort. And let me just mention to you what it was like in the old days. When I first became DA, I went out in a surveillance van in Alphabet City, and drug dealers came up to the van, broad daylight, offered to sell me drugs with a uniformed police officer standing 20 feet away doing nothing. I told Mayor Beam about this and persuaded him to go out in an unmarked car into a high drug area, and he went out and they tried to sell the mayor drugs. That's what it was like in 1975, 1976. Going back even further, when my chief assistant, Vincent Broderick, became police commissioner, and he went out one night to survey the territory with a senior police officer, and as they were driving by, they saw a man pick up a brick and throw it through the glass window of a bar. Kept going. He said to the senior police officer, "Well, aren't you going to stop?" He said, "No, Commissioner, we don't stop for that sort of thing." So it's been a long, hard fight to get the police department where they are today, when they have the training, courage to make the necessary stops. Now, people think that there's a bright red line between a legal stop and an illegal stop. Let me just refer you to a 1976 decision, which is still the law, People v. Le Pen. In that case, there were two police officers out on radio patrol. They got a message that an informant had said there was a man in the bar, black man in the bar, wearing a red shirt and carrying a gun. Second patrol car got the same message. They went in, they saw this individual, they arrested him, took him out, carrying a gun. When it reached the Court of Appeals, in its wisdom, said, "Informant of unknown reliability," suppressed the search and the arrest. So that's the kind of thing that the police officers have been up against. Do I make the arrest? And then there's somebody going to say, it's illegal, it's an illegal arrest. And remember that every time you go into a bar with a man allegedly carrying a gun, you're risking your life. So that now with this new legislation, you're not only greatly adding to the burdens on the police officer on the street, our first line of defense, but you're also subjecting them to civil liability. And I personally, if I were out there and I saw somebody looking suspicious, knowing that I was risking my life every time I made a stop, knowing that I might be found having violated the law, knowing that I might be subject to civil liability, I think I'd keep walking. And that's where we were. That's where we were in the 60s and 70s. Now, we don't want to go back to that. But if this legislation is enacted, it's going to be a major disincentive for police officers to stop people, question them, and frisk them. And that's going to be, frankly, a disaster for the city, and that long uphill fight, which has resulted in a pretty good plateau. The city's not perfect. There's more crime now than we'd like to have in some neighborhoods, but that can be reversed, and the downhill travel will be 10 times as fast. And then somebody will say, oh, well, we got to go back, but it'll take a long time to get back to where we are. So I say to you, you're risking cop on the beat from making a decision to stop when you threaten them with civil liability and give him confusing instructions and multiple oversights. And one final thing I'd like to mention. The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta just put out a report saying that African American males are 70% more likely to die by gunfire than white males. Now, what's the city council going to do about that? That's a serious problem. That's a violation of civil rights, and this legislation will not help that. It'll hurt that effort. So if the city council wants to do something that's important, let's see how they can reduce or propose the reduction of the murder of African American males, now 70% greater than the murder of whites. See that they can't bring that 70% down. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you. Your comments are, you come from a perspective that few people, unfortunately, particularly younger people, have. People don't remember what the city was like back when and how much better we are now. I was describing it this morning to some visitors from Brazil, Sao Paulo, where everybody that can afford it has an armed car, where everybody that can afford it has barbed wire around their homes and armed guards from 2 different services outside in case somebody can corrupt one of them. And I pointed out to the woman that in New York City, she could walk in any neighborhood in New York City during the day without looking over her shoulder, and most neighborhoods at night. That is just not a luxury, a freedom that people in a great percentage of the world have. Let us now turn to representatives of the NYPD supervisors and officers who are with us today, starting with Roy Richter, the president of the Captains Endowment Association. Roy?
Well, thank you, Mayor. It's important for our elected leaders to get involved with important issues facing society today. And unfortunately, with that, politics comes into play. So my comments are not based upon politics, but more on right and wrong. And let me just tell you a couple things. Racial profiling is wrong, and it's illegal. Quotas are wrong, and they're illegal. Everything in this bill is wrong, and it should not be passed. What do I mean by that? It's wrong to make a police officer acting in good faith, responding to a crime victim, to make him personally liable for doing nothing more than transmitting a description of a perpetrator to another officer acting in good faith, many times blocks away, and stopping that person. That should not subject an officer to a personal lawsuit. It should not put their family at risk. It should not put themselves at risk. That's what my message today is, basically to the City Council to vote no on this legislation and to keep politics out of policing. Thank you.
Roy, thank you. Next, Louis Turco. He's president of the Lieutenants Benevolent Association.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to elaborate on what Roy was just saying in regards to police officers with civil liability, you also got to take into effect that when an officer, man or woman on the street, hesitates, that's life and death. You have to be very careful when you hesitate out there. There's no timeouts. You don't get a second call at this. So if you hesitate, that puts the officers in harm's way. It puts the general public in harm's way. Civil liability may make that officer hesitate. With that, creates problems for us out there and puts us in danger. In regards to the IG bill, our officers right now have a very competent IAB division, Department Advocate division, CCRB agency, inspections throughout the commands and throughout the department, 5 district attorneys. This is unnecessary. This is unnecessary to have another agency out there when you have all these people looking at our offices. It's politics. It doesn't belong in policing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed Mullins is president of the Sergeants Benevolent Association. Ed?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, everyone. Listening to everyone speak, I want to go back a little bit to the late 80s. There was an individual here from Utah, Brian Watson, who was killed up, I believe, on a 6th Avenue subway. His whole family was here to see the U.S. Open. In the 90s, 6-7 precinct, female, Sherry Ford. The same summer, 2 males gunned down, broad daylight, sunny day in July, 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. These times have changed, okay? The people who spoke for all of these people are all of us, the people in this building, and in so many ways, each of you. Because many times we come to you to get the message out. And to change the laws now, to tie our hands now, is not speaking for these people at all. It's not. It's not happening. Okay? This is political pandering at the most. I question if this wasn't a mayor's election year, if this piece of legislation would even come out. Where was the speaker? Where was the city council all these previous years? I never heard them once call up and ask about any one of the individuals I mentioned. It's not a good piece of legislation. And lastly, what we're talking about is leadership. Leadership isn't just stepping forward and giving direction. It's about making the tough decisions. It's doing the right thing even if it's unpopular. I don't understand how you can praise Commissioner Kelly all year long, want to keep him, and then want someone to watch him. It makes no sense. It's illogical. And I'll be the first to say I've disagreed many times with him. But you have a very competent police commissioner, and you don't need someone else to watch a police commissioner. Mr. Mayor.
Ed, thank you. Next, Michael Palladino. He's president of the Detectives Endowment Association. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I said most of what I wanted to say in my open letter today in the Daily News on page 15. But this morning I accused the City Council of being spoiled. Over the last 12 years, crime has gotten lower and lower in the neighborhoods that they represent. And they've enjoyed that low crime because it makes life a lot easier for them in the end to do a budget with the mayor. So I think that crime has nowhere to go but up. But what I'd like to say this morning is that this legislation is very dangerous because, no matter how many times you read it, and I've read it thoroughly quite a few times, it creates this presumption. And when you create a presumption, what you're saying is the police are guilty of bias-based profiling, and then the burden of proof rests on the police officer or officers and the agency to rebut that presumption of guilt in a court of law. So I don't quite frankly know how the police, or no matter what business you're in, how you can operate effectively and efficiently when you're threatened with doing your basic job function and then ending up being the subject of a lawsuit. So I certainly, have urging the City Council to reconsider their position to either withdraw the legislation or at the very least, let's delay any action on the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Our final speaker is Patrick Lynch. He is president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association. Patrick.
When you think of these bills, and after listening to D.A. Morgenthau speak, the thing that comes to mind is been there, done that. The City Council should not be taking their time passing laws that are unnecessary. There's laws on the book that address each one of their perceived concerns. The most dangerous thing a police officer can face on the street is doubt in his or her decision. Response time and instinct is what keeps us alive. This law will make the streets more violent for the members of our communities, and it will absolutely make it more dangerous for our police officers. And it's not being dramatic when we say, in good times, unfortunately, many times we have to shoulder a brother or sister police officer and carry them into our religious institution. This multiplies that danger tenfold. The City Council should reconsider. It should focus on what needs to be done in this city. It should also be out there supporting its police officers as our communities do each and every day. Putting doubt in our minds is dangerous. Passing laws that are unnecessary are a waste of time for the city. City Council should rethink these bills.
Patrick, thank you. Let me just remind everybody, as I started out, this is a police department that fires their firearms dramatically fewer times per capita than any other major city. This is a city where we incarcerate a third fewer people than most cities do. And the trends are going in the wrong direction elsewhere in the country, but in this direction, they're all going in the right direction. Crime, murder continues to go down. Yes, we have a problem. It is our young male kids that are described by witnesses and victims as committing crime, and certainly it is our young male citizens that show up in the morgue. We have to do something about that problem. But one of the things we have done is we've kept 7,300 of them alive that would have otherwise been dead by reducing the number of people that are carrying guns, by supporting our police officers so they can make intelligent, spur-of-the-moment, life-threatening and life-saving decisions. That's why we've been able to have the greatest police department in the world, and that's why we continue to attract the best and the brightest to join our police department. But we cannot leave them in a situation, or the commissioner in the situation, where there are questions about who's in charge. No organization can function that way, particularly one where people's lives are on the line. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, but before we take some questions, let me just remind everyone that the National Weather Service has issued a heat advisory for New York City from today through 6 p.m. tomorrow, and on both days the heat index is expected to exceed 95 degrees. These conditions can be dangerous, especially for those without air conditioning, the elderly, and those with chronic health conditions. So in response, we have opened more than 400 cooling centers throughout the city for those needing relief from the heat, for their locations and hours. And for more information on avoiding heat-related illnesses, you can go to nyc.gov or call 311. Just don't try to exercise in the hot sun. Drink a lot of water, wear light clothing. And it would be very nice and make a lot of sense to today and tomorrow check in on family, friends, and neighbors, particularly the elderly and the infirm, to make sure they are okay. Before taking questions, let me just summarize today's announcement in Spanish. Estamos aquí para pedirles el Consejo Municipal que rechazan los dos proyectos de ley que harán más difícil el trabajo de prevenir crímenes y mantener a nuestra ciudad segura. And with that, we'll be happy to take a few questions.